My sister stood beside my ruined wedding cake, chocolate crumbs still clinging to her manicured nails. Oops, Pippa laughed, her voice dripping with false sympathy, as 3 tiers of my dream cake lay scattered across the venue floor. I guess some people just aren't meant for fairy tale endings. The wedding guests gasped in horror, but I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply reached into my purse and pressed a single button on my phone.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
Within minutes, my father, FBI Director Paul Holden, would have everything he needed to destroy her completely. But let me tell you how I got here, how a lifetime of living in Pippa's shadow led to this moment when federal justice would finally balance the scales. The call came exactly 47 minutes after my wedding cake hit the floor. Dad's voice was ice-cold professional, the tone he reserved for the most serious criminal investigations. "Megan, I need you to stay exactly where you are. Don't touch anything, don't clean anything up, and don't let anyone leave that venue. This is now an active federal investigation." Standing in my destroyed wedding dress, surrounded by the chaos of my sister's latest cruelty, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 28 years, the absolute certainty that justice was coming. Not the kind of justice that depends on family dynamics or social pressure, but the kind that comes with badges, warrants, and federal prosecuting attorneys. You see, what Pippa didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I hadn't called Dad as a daughter seeking comfort. I'd activated a federal investigation that had been building for months, triggered by a single text message that would bring down a conspiracy so elaborate it made my sister's wedding cake sabotage look like child's play. The irony wasn't lost on me. For nearly 3 decades, I'd watched my younger sister charm her way out of every consequence, manipulate every situation to her advantage, and destroy everything I'd tried to build with a smile that could melt glaciers. She was beautiful, charismatic, and utterly ruthless, qualities that had served her well in the high-stakes world of corporate consulting, where she'd made her fortune. But there's one thing about growing up as the daughter of an FBI director that Pippa had never quite grasped. I knew the difference between correlation and causation, between bad luck and deliberate sabotage, and most importantly, between family loyalty and federal crimes. The wedding cake was just the final piece of evidence I needed. 3 hours earlier, I'd stood in the bridal suite of the Grandview estate, adjusting my grandmother's pearl necklace one final time. The morning had been perfect, exactly the kind of fairy tale beginning I dreamed of since childhood. My maid of honor, Esther Ames, was arranging my train with reverent care, while my mother fluttered around making final adjustments to everything from my lipstick to the positioning of my veil. "You look absolutely radiant, sweetheart," Mom whispered, tears glittering in her eyes. "Tanner is going to fall over when he sees you." Tanner Colby. Just thinking his name made my heart skip. We'd met 18 months ago at a cybersecurity conference in Denver, where his presentation on data breach prevention had captivated an audience of hardened IT professionals. But it was the way he'd blushed when I'd approached him afterward with questions about his methodology that had captured my heart. He was brilliant, kind, and refreshingly honest, everything Pippa's usual conquests weren't. More importantly, he saw me, not as Paul Holden's daughter or Pippa's sister, but as Megan, the federal prosecutor who'd built her career on meticulous attention to detail and an unwavering commitment to justice. That should have been my first warning. In our family, when Megan Holden was truly happy, Pippa Holden took notice. The cake had been my one indulgence, my single moment of pure vanity in an otherwise modest wedding. While other brides obsessed over flowers or dresses, I'd spent months working with celebrated pastry chef Camilla Lester to create something truly spectacular. 4 tiers of alternating chocolate and vanilla, decorated with hand-piped sugar flowers that matched my bouquet exactly. It was a work of art that had cost more than my car, but seeing it in the venue's main hall that morning had made every penny worth it. Pippa had admired it extensively during the rehearsal dinner, running her fingers along the display table's edge while asking detailed questions about the flavoring and construction. "It's so elaborate," she'd said, with that particular smile I'd learned to fear. "I hope nothing happens to it before the ceremony." At the time, I thought she was just being her usual dramatic self. Pippa had always had a flair for creating tension where none existed, for finding ways to inject uncertainty in other people's happiness. It was her signature move, as predictable as sunrise. What I hadn't realized was that she'd been photographing the cake's structural weak points, mapping the exact pressure required to create maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. The kind of calculated precision that would have impressed even Dad's most seasoned investigators. The ceremony itself had been flawless. Tanner's eyes had indeed filled with tears when he saw me walking down the aisle, and his vows had been so heartfelt that even the photographer had to pause to wipe his lens. When we kissed as husband and wife, I felt like every difficult moment in my life had been worth this perfect happiness. The reception was in full swing when it happened. I was dancing with my new father-in-law when I heard the collective gasp from the dessert area. By the time I turned around, Pippa was already in full performance mode, her face a mask of horror and concern as she stood beside the ruins of my cake.
"I was just trying to straighten the ribbon," she said, her voice carrying perfectly across the stunned silence. "The table must have been unstable. Oh, Megan, I'm so sorry." But I'd seen the telltale signs before she'd even finished her Oscar-worthy performance. The chocolate smears on her wrist that she thought her bracelet had hidden. The way she'd positioned herself for maximum witness visibility. Most damning of all, the micro-expression of satisfaction that flickered across her face for exactly 0.7 seconds before the fake devastation took over. Growing up in Paul Holden's house meant learning to read people the way other children learn to read books. Micro-expressions, behavioral baselines, deception indicators, these weren't advanced federal training concepts to me, they were dinner table conversation. That's when I'd reached for my phone and pressed the button that would change everything. Not to call for cleanup or comfort, but to activate the federal investigation that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Because the wedding cake wasn't the crime, it was just the final piece of evidence proving that Pippa Holden had been systematically destroying my life through means that fell squarely within federal jurisdiction. And my father, FBI Director Paul Holden, was about to prove it with the full weight of the United States government behind him. From the moment I entered this world 18 months after Pippa, she became the sun around which our family orbited. But growing up as the daughter of an FBI director meant that even our childhood dynamics were subject to a level of scrutiny that most families never experience. I remember my 9th birthday party vividly, not because it was particularly joyful, but because it was the first time I consciously recognized the pattern that would define our relationship for the next 2 decades. 23 kids from school, a detective-themed party I'd planned for weeks around Dad's work stories, and elaborate mystery games I'd designed with Mom's help. Then Pippa wandered into the backyard wearing a sparkly princess costume, her golden hair catching the afternoon sunlight like a halo. She was 7, supposedly too young to participate in the big kid activities, but within minutes, every guest had abandoned my carefully planned treasure hunt to fawn over my little sister's impromptu magic show. The photos from that day still exist in Mom's albums. Me standing alone beside my untouched Sherlock Holmes cake while everyone crowded around Pippa, who basked in the attention like she was born for it. Dad later told me he'd noticed the disappointment in my eyes even then, filing it away in that methodical mind of his that cataloged everything. That pattern repeated itself with mathematical precision throughout our childhood.
Christmas mornings where Pippa's theatrical gift opening ceremonies overshadowed my quiet gratitude. School concerts where Mom's camera focused exclusively on Pippa's kindergarten solo while my 8th grade honor society induction went unrecorded. Family dinners where Dad would ask about her finger paintings while my academic achievements earned a distracted, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," without him even looking from his case files.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But the most telling incident happened when I was 14 and Pippa was 12. I'd spent months preparing for the regional debate championship, staying after school every day to perfect my arguments about constitutional law, a subject that fascinated me precisely because it connected to Dad's work. The tournament was held on the same Saturday as Pippa's dance recital. I won first place in the state for my age group, earning automatic qualification for nationals and a scholarship consideration from Georgetown University's pre-law program. The local newspaper featured a small article about it buried on page 8. That same week, Pippa's dance studio selected her for a featured role in their spring showcase, something that happened to dozens of kids every year. Her photo graced the front page of the lifestyle section. Mom framed Pippa's article and hung it in the living room. My trophy gathered dust on my bedroom shelf until I packed it away for college. "You're just different types of special," Mom would say whenever I dared voice my hurt. But we both knew which type of special mattered more in our house. Even Dad, with all his training and behavioral analysis and family dynamics, seemed helpless against Pippa's particular brand of charisma. The irony was that I genuinely loved my father's work. While other kids found his stories about federal investigations boring or frightening, I was fascinated by the methodical process of evidence collection, the careful construction of cases that could withstand scrutiny in federal court. I asked questions about jurisdictional boundaries, about the difference between circumstantial and direct evidence, about how agents built timelines that could prove criminal intent. Dad encouraged this interest, teaching me to observe details others missed, to recognize patterns in seemingly random events, to document everything with the kind of precision that would satisfy a federal judge. These skills served me well in school, where teachers praised my analytical thinking and thorough research methods. But they also made me acutely aware of things I might have preferred to ignore. By high school, I'd learned to measure my worth in shadows, understanding that some lights were simply too bright to compete with. When Pippa made varsity cheerleading as a freshman, something unheard of at Lincoln Academy, the local sports reporter interviewed her for a feature story about young athletes breaking barriers. The same week, I'd been selected for a summer internship at the U.S. Attorney's Office, the youngest student ever accepted into their program. My achievement merited a brief mention in the school newsletter. Pippa's interview was picked up by regional media outlets and shared across social media platforms. College offered temporary escape from the Golden Girl comparisons. At Northwestern University, I threw myself into pre-law studies and criminal justice coursework, building something that was entirely mine. My professors appreciated my unique perspective. Growing up in an FBI director's household had given me insights into federal law enforcement that most students couldn't match. I graduated summa cum laude and went directly to law school at Georgetown, where I specialized in federal prosecution. My thesis on cybercrime jurisdiction earned recognition from the Department of Justice, leading to a position as an assistant U.S. attorney immediately after passing the bar. For the first time in my life, I felt valuable, irreplaceable. The courtroom was the one place where charm couldn't substitute for competence, where theatrical performances meant nothing compared to solid evidence and legal precedent. I won my first 12 cases, earning a reputation as a prosecutor who never brought charges unless she was absolutely certain of conviction. Meanwhile, Pippa had leveraged her natural charisma into a successful career in corporate consulting, specializing in crisis management and public relations. She had a gift for making clients believe she could solve any problem, manage any scandal, rebuild any reputation. Her firm, Meridian Strategic Solutions, had attracted high-profile clients ranging from Fortune 500 companies to political campaigns. On the surface, we were both successful professional women who'd found our respective niches. Family gatherings became more pleasant as we aged, with less direct competition and more mature conversation about our different career paths. But success hadn't changed the fundamental dynamic between us. Pippa still commanded every room she entered, still made everyone feel like supporting players in her personal drama. The difference was that now I understood the mechanisms behind her influence, could recognize the subtle manipulation techniques that made people want to please her. What I didn't realize was that those same techniques, when applied systematically over time, could constitute a federal crime. The first hint came 6 months before my wedding, during what I thought was a casual conversation about venue planning. The promotion to senior federal prosecutor should have been the culmination of everything I'd worked toward. After 5 years of flawless case management and a conviction rate that had caught the attention of the Attorney General's office, I was the obvious choice for the position. My supervisor, District Attorney Sean Ames, had all but promised me the role during my annual review. "You've got the most sophisticated understanding of federal cybercrime law I've seen in 20 years, he'd told me that Tuesday morning. "The Meridian Tech case alone should have earned you a commendation. I can't imagine anyone more qualified for senior prosecution." The Meridian Tech case had been my masterpiece, a complex investigation involving corporate espionage, wire fraud, and international money laundering that had taken 18 months to build. 3 different companies had been stealing trade secrets and selling them to overseas competitors using a sophisticated network of shell corporations and cryptocurrency transactions to hide their activities. I'd worked 16-hour days for the better part of a year, coordinating with FBI cybercrimes units, international law enforcement agencies, and financial crime specialists. The final indictment was 847 pages long and resulted in convictions for all 14 defendants, with combined sentences totaling over 200 years. When Mr. Ames called me into his office the following Thursday, I walked in expecting congratulations and paperwork. Instead, he offered condolences about my disappointment and assured me that next time would be different. The promotion went to Esther Ames, his niece, who'd been with the prosecutor's office for exactly 18 months and had never handled a case involving more than basic fraud charges. Her most significant courtroom victory had been a plea agreement for a check-kiting scheme that involved less than $50,000. The explanation was vague, something about interpersonal dynamics and team leadership potential, words that felt like knives twisting in my chest, especially coming from a man who'd praised my leadership skills for years. "I don't understand," I said, my voice carefully controlled despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "What interpersonal dynamics? My case clearance rate is the highest in the office. My team coordination scores have been exemplary." Mr. Ames shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding my eyes in a way that immediately triggered every deception detection instinct Dad had taught me. "There have been some concerns raised about your collaborative approach, some feedback suggesting that your intensity can be overwhelming for other team members." "What feedback? From whom?" "I can't get into specifics, but several colleagues have mentioned feeling intimidated by your thoroughness. There's a difference between being competent and being accessible, Megan. Leadership requires emotional intelligence as much as legal acumen." The words were devastating precisely because they were so perfectly calibrated to hurt. Every insecurity I'd ever felt about being too serious, too focused, too much came flooding back. But underneath the hurt was something else, a nagging sense that this explanation didn't align with my recent experiences. Just 2 weeks earlier, my colleague Paul Lester had specifically requested me for his organized crime task force, saying my attention to detail was exactly what they needed for their racketeering case. Last month, 3 different federal agencies had asked for my input on cybercrime jurisdiction issues. My team had thrown me a surprise birthday party where they'd presented me with a plaque calling me the most supportive supervisor they'd ever worked with. None of that matched the picture Mr. Ames was painting of an intimidating, inaccessible colleague who couldn't work effectively with others. That night, I called Dad from my apartment, needing to process what had happened with someone who understood the complexities of federal office politics. "Something doesn't add up," he said after I'd finished explaining the situation. "I've seen your performance evaluations through unofficial channels. They're exemplary. and I've heard nothing but praise about your work from colleagues in other agencies. Then why? I don't know yet, but my instincts are telling me this isn't about your performance or leadership style. Someone wanted you specifically excluded from that position, and they found a way to make it happen that couldn't be easily challenged. Dad's words planted a seed of suspicion that would grow over the coming months. But at the time, I was too devastated to think clearly about conspiracies or sabotage. I just felt like I was reliving every childhood disappointment, every moment when I'd been passed over for someone more likable. The dress discovery came 3 weeks later, like a beacon of hope in an otherwise dark period. I'd been walking past Enchanted Moments bridal boutique downtown when something in the window display caught my eye and literally stopped me in my tracks. It was the most beautiful gown I'd ever seen, champagne silk with intricate beadwork that caught the afternoon light like scattered diamonds. The design was sophisticated without being ostentatious, elegant without being overdone. It looked like something a serious professional woman might choose for the most important day of her life. The price tag made my stomach drop. $4,000, more than I'd ever spent on anything for myself except my law school education. But standing in that fitting room, watching the way the silk fabric moved with every breath, seeing how the beadwork made my skin glow, I felt beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with other people's opinions. "Oh my goodness," the saleswoman breathed when I emerged from the dressing room. "That dress was made for you. You look absolutely radiant." Even the other customers in the boutique stopped their own shopping to stare. For once in my life, I was the one commanding attention simply by existing, simply by being myself in something that highlighted my natural grace rather than requiring me to compete with anyone else's charisma. I bought it that day, despite my modest government salary and the student loans I was still paying off. For the next 6 months, I ate lunch at my desk, skipped dinners out with friends, and walked to work to save on parking fees. Every sacrifice felt worth it when I glimpsed the dress hanging in my bedroom closet, wrapped in protective plastic like a precious secret. That dress represented everything I'd never dared hope for. A moment when I would be the center of attention for all the right reasons, when my happiness wouldn't be overshadowed by someone else's drama. I had no idea that it was already being systematically targeted for destruction. The coffee shop meeting that changed everything happened on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening in March. I ducked into Greystone Cafe to escape the sudden downpour, my briefcase soaked despite my umbrella's valiant efforts against the wind. The prosecution case I'd been reviewing was probably water damaged, but that seemed less important when I spotted him sitting alone at a corner table. Tanner Colby looked exactly like what he was, a brilliant cybersecurity expert who spent more time thinking about code than his appearance. His dark hair was slightly disheveled from his own battle with the weather, and he had that particular intensity that came from being completely absorbed in whatever was on his laptop screen. When he looked up and smiled, offering to share his corner table with the stranger dripping rainwater onto the cafe floor, I felt something shift inside my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. "Rough day?" he asked, nodding toward my soggy folder. "Career-ending disaster, more likely," I laughed, surprised by my own honesty. Federal prosecution and March weather don't mix well. Federal prosecution? His eyes lit up with genuine interest. That must be fascinating work. I'm always curious about the intersection between cybercrime and federal jurisdiction. Most people's eyes glazed over when I mentioned my job. They either found it intimidating or boring, occasionally both. But Tanner leaned forward, asking thoughtful questions about digital evidence standards and cross-jurisdictional cooperation protocols. When I mentioned my work on the Meridian Tech case, he practically lit up. "You prosecuted that case? The cryptocurrency laundering scheme with the shell companies in 3 different countries? That was brilliant work. The legal framework you established for international digital evidence has become the standard for cases like that." For the first time in months, I felt truly seen, not as Paul Holden's daughter or Pippa's sister, but as Megan, the federal prosecutor who'd built innovative legal strategies for emerging technology crimes. Our conversation lasted 4 hours. I learned that Tanner had started his own cybersecurity consulting firm after working for the NSA for 6 years. He specialized in helping corporations identify vulnerabilities before bad actors could exploit them, essentially playing the role of ethical hacker for companies that wanted to stay ahead of real criminals. It's like being a federal prosecutor, in a way, he said, as the cafe began closing around us. You have to think like the criminals to catch them, understand their methods well enough to stay one step ahead. When he asked if I'd like to continue the conversation over dinner somewhere with better lighting and worse coffee, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about spending time with someone who appreciated my mind as much as my company. Our first official date stretched until nearly midnight. Tanner had this way of making me feel like the only person in the room, like my thoughts and opinions mattered deeply to him. He remembered small details about my cases, asked follow-up questions about legal precedents I'd mentioned weeks earlier, and never once checked his phone during our conversations. For the next 8 months, we built something beautiful and private. Sunday morning farmers market visits where he'd buy me fresh flowers, just because he liked seeing me smile. Quiet dinners where we discussed everything from Supreme Court decisions to childhood dreams to his latest theories about emerging cybersecurity threats. Tanner made me feel intellectually valued in ways I'd never experienced. He celebrated my courtroom victories, offered comfort during setbacks, and never once made me feel like I was competing for his attention. When I won a particularly difficult case involving international wire fraud, he surprised me with a bottle of champagne and a card that read, "To the brilliant woman who makes justice look effortless." More importantly, he seemed genuinely unimpressed by superficial charm or manipulation. During our early dates, I'd watch him interact with servers who flirted outrageously or colleagues who tried to monopolize his attention with dramatic stories. He was polite, but remained focused on our conversation, never allowing himself to be drawn into other people's performances. "I prefer substance to spectacle," he told me once, when I commented on his ability to ignore distractions. "Real beauty comes from authenticity, not artifice." It was exactly the kind of relationship I'd never dared hope for, built on mutual respect, intellectual compatibility, and genuine affection rather than competition or need. Which should have been my first warning sign. The family dinner invitation came 6 months into our relationship, delivered with Mom's characteristic enthusiasm over the phone. "I can't wait to meet this mysterious boyfriend," she said. "Bring him to Sunday dinner this week. Pippa will be there too. She's been dying to meet him." I should have known better. I should have remembered that in our family, when Megan Holden found genuine happiness, Pippa Holden took notice. But I was so confident in what Tanner and I had built, so secure in our intellectual connection, that I actually looked forward to introducing him to my family. The moment Tanner stepped into our childhood home, I watched my sister's entire demeanor shift. She appeared at the top of the stairs like something out of a movie, wearing a flowing emerald dress that perfectly complemented her eyes. Her hair cascaded over her shoulders in waves that seemed to catch every ray of sunlight streaming through the windows. "So, you're the famous Tanner," she said, extending her hand with a smile that could have powered the entire neighborhood. "I've heard absolutely nothing about you, which means my sister is either very secretive or very selfish." Tanner laughed, that easy, genuine laugh I'd fallen in love with, and I felt the first crack in my foundation. Throughout dinner, Pippa deployed every weapon in her considerable arsenal. She peppered him with questions about his company, his cybersecurity work, his plans for expanding into international markets. She leaned forward when he spoke, laughed at his jokes with perfect timing, and shared just enough about her own crisis management work to seem fascinating without overshadowing him. I watched it happen in real time, the subtle shift in Tanner's attention, the way his responses to Pippa grew longer and more animated, while his answers to me became polite but distracted. By dessert, I felt like a stranger at my own relationship's funeral. "Your sister is remarkable," Tanner said on the drive home, his voice carrying a warmth that used to be reserved for me alone. I had no idea she worked in crisis management. The stories she told about rebuilding corporate reputations after major scandals, that's fascinating work. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, forcing my voice to remain steady. She's always been good at managing situations to her advantage. It must be amazing having someone so dynamic in the family. The way she talked about international consulting, working with Fortune 500 companies, and she's so well traveled. Did you know she speaks 4 languages? Actually, I did know. I also knew that Pippa had learned those languages specifically to expand her client base, viewing each one of a business investment rather than cultural enrichment. But explaining that would sound petty, jealous, exactly the kind of reaction she was counting on. That night, lying in bed beside my carefully preserved wedding dress, I finally understood what I'd been too naive to see before. Some shadows were too deep to escape, some golden lights too bright to compete with. But I had no idea how far Pippa would go to ensure I never stepped out of the darkness again. The phone rang 3 days later while I was reviewing case files in my office. Pippa's voice bubbled through the speaker with unusual enthusiasm. "Hey, I was thinking, since Tanner seems so wonderful, why don't we all do something together this weekend? Maybe that new rooftop bar downtown? I could bring Marcus." Marcus was her latest acquisition, a hedge fund manager she'd been seeing for exactly 3 weeks. The suggestion seemed innocent enough, but something in her tone made my stomach tighten. There was a predatory quality to her enthusiasm, like a cat suggesting playtime to a mouse. "I don't know, Pippa. Tanner and I were planning a quiet weekend." "Oh, come on, it'll be fun. Besides, I barely got to talk to him at dinner. I want to get to know the man who's stolen my sister's heart." Against every instinct screaming warnings in my head, I agreed. Saturday evening, I spent an hour getting ready, settling on a black cocktail dress that Tanner had once said looked stunning on me. When we arrived at the bar, Pippa was already there, wearing a flowing sapphire dress that seemed to shimmer under the ambient lighting. She looked like she'd stepped off a magazine cover, while I suddenly felt overdressed and trying too hard. "Tanner," she exclaimed, standing to embrace him with the kind of warmth typically reserved for old friends. "You look fantastic. That shirt brings out your eyes." Throughout the evening, I watched Pippa work her magic with the precision of a master surgeon. She remembered every detail Tanner had mentioned at dinner: his college cybersecurity club, his consulting firm's expansion plans, even his hiking trip to Colorado the previous summer. When Marcus stepped away to take a call, she seamlessly shifted all her attention to Tanner, leaning in conspiratorially as she shared stories about their mutual interest in technology ethics. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said about corporate vulnerability assessments," she said, touching his arm lightly. "My firm could really use someone with your expertise. We're always dealing with clients who've been breached, and having someone who could prevent the problems instead of just managing the aftermath." "That's actually something I've been considering," Tanner replied, his eyes lighting up in a way I recognized but had never been able to inspire myself. Proactive security consulting versus reactive damage control. "Exactly. You should come by my office sometime. I'd love to pick your brain about some of our current cases. My sound system does justice to complex problems. We could really dive deep into the cybersecurity landscape." The invitation hung in the air like a challenge I couldn't meet. I didn't have cutting-edge consulting offices or high-profile corporate clients. I had a government cubicle and federal cases that moved at bureaucratic speed. Monday morning brought the first crack in my professional foundation. I arrived at the prosecutor's office to find my assistant looking uncomfortable as she approached my desk. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Ames wants to see you immediately," she said. "It's about the Blackstone Industries case." The Blackstone case was my current project, a complex money laundering investigation I'd been building for 4 months. I'd crafted their entire criminal enterprise map, tracking financial flows through 7 different shell companies across 3 states. The grand jury presentation was scheduled for Friday, and I'd been preparing obsessively. Mr. Ames's office felt colder than usual as I sat across from his imposing desk. "I'm reassigning Blackstone to Paul Lester," he said, without preamble. "He'll be presenting your preliminary work to the grand jury." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Sir, I don't understand. Is there a problem with my approach?" "It's not about problems. It's about fit. Paul has more experience with complex financial crimes. But I've been developing this case since the beginning. I identified the money laundering patterns. I mapped the corporate structures. The decision is final. His tone broke no argument. You'll be taking over the Henderson Municipal corruption case instead. Henderson Municipal was a small-town bribery case involving a mayor and some construction contracts. Straightforward, local, barely worth federal attention. As I walked back to my desk, I felt eyes following me, whispers trailing in my wake. The technical difficulties started immediately after that. An important email to a federal judge disappeared from my sent folder, leaving me scrambling to explain why I hadn't followed up on his request for case precedent research. My calendar mysteriously cleared itself of a crucial grand jury preparation meeting, causing me to miss a deadline that resulted in a 2-week delay for an entire racketeering case. A presentation file corrupted exactly 1 hour before I was supposed to deliver it to a room full of federal agents, forcing me to improvise with handwritten notes while my colleagues exchanged concerned glances. These things happen, I told myself, but the incidents were becoming too frequent and too precisely timed to ignore. Each technical failure seemed designed to occur at the exact moment when it would cause maximum professional damage. The corruption investigation I'd inherited was falling apart spectacularly. Key witnesses were changing their stories, claiming they'd been misunderstood during their initial interviews. Evidence that had seemed solid was being challenged by defense attorneys who somehow knew exactly which procedural technicalities to exploit. Even my usual contacts in federal law enforcement were being transferred to other cases or suddenly becoming unavailable for consultations. Tanner's behavior began shifting around the same time. Our nightly phone calls, once lasting hours as we discussed everything from legal theory to weekend plans, dwindled to brief check-ins about scheduling and logistics. When we did spend time together, he seemed distracted, frequently glancing at his phone or bringing up topics I'd never heard him discuss before. Pippa mentioned this fascinating article about cybersecurity and crisis management, he said during dinner one Tuesday evening. She thinks there might be some opportunities for collaboration between her firm and my consulting practice. When did you talk to Pippa about business opportunities? Oh, she texted me some recommendations. She's really thoughtful that way, always looking for ways to help people make connections. The casual way he said it, like ongoing communication with my sister was perfectly normal, made my chest tighten. I wanted to ask when they'd exchanged numbers, what other recommendations she'd shared, why she was inserting herself into his professional development. Instead, I smiled and nodded, swallowing my questions like bitter medicine. The pattern continued with clockwork precision. Pippa would mention a restaurant she thought Tanner would love, and suddenly he'd suggest we try it. She'd recommend a book about technology ethics, and I'd find it on his nightstand with passages highlighted in her distinctive purple ink. Their inside jokes multiplied, references to conversations I hadn't been part of, shared opinions about articles I'd never heard them discuss. Pippa was saying how important it is for cybersecurity professionals to understand the human psychology behind corporate breaches, Tanner mentioned during what would be our last normal weekend together. She's offered to introduce me to some of her crisis management clients who've dealt with major security incidents. That's generous of her, I managed, though the word felt like glass in my throat. She really gets it, the intersection between technology and human behavior. Most people see cybersecurity as purely technical, but she understands that the real vulnerabilities are always human. I stared at him across our dinner table, recognizing the language he was using. Those weren't his words, they were Pippa's. Somehow, in the space of a few weeks, my sister had managed to colonize not just his attention, but his thinking patterns. That night, I lay awake listening to Tanner's breathing beside me, trying to pinpoint exactly when everything had started going wrong. The professional sabotage, the technical failures, the systematic dismantling of my carefully built career, it all seemed to coincide with Pippa's sudden interest in my relationship. But correlation wasn't causation, and I was a federal prosecutor trained to deal in evidence, not suspicions. Without proof, these were just the paranoid thoughts of someone struggling with professional setbacks and relationship insecurity. The proof came 2 weeks later, delivered with devastating casualness during what I thought was a routine conversation about weekend plans. Maybe we should take a little break, Tanner said, his voice careful and rehearsed, like he'd practiced the words in his mirror. I've been feeling overwhelmed lately with the business expansion, and I think I need some space to figure things out. Space from what? I asked, though I already knew the answer would destroy me. From us, from this relationship. I need time to think about what I really want. The words felt like they'd been lifted from a script, delivered with the kind of gentle regret that was meant to minimize guilt while maximizing finality. I wanted to fight for us, to demand explanations, to ask what had changed so dramatically in the space of a few months. Instead, I heard myself agreeing that space might be good for both of us, that we should both take time to evaluate our priorities. That night, I stared at my wedding dress hanging in the closet, wondering when everything had started falling apart. The foundation I'd spent years building, my career, my relationship, my sense of self, felt like it was crumbling beneath my feet. I had no idea that the destruction was just beginning, or that the architect of my downfall was closer than I'd ever imagined. The call came on a Friday afternoon while I was drowning in damage control from another mysteriously botched witness interview. My laptop screen had frozen during a video conference with 3 federal judges, leaving me scrambling to explain why the prosecution's key evidence presentation had devolved into technical chaos. Pippa's voice carried just the right note of helpless frustration when she called. "Megan, I hate to bother you at work, but I have this huge crisis presentation for Meridian Strategic tomorrow morning, and my entire system just crashed. You're so brilliant with technology. Could you possibly come over tonight and help me recover the files? I'm absolutely desperate." Despite everything that had happened, the professional disasters, Tanner's sudden distance, the growing sense that my life was spiraling beyond my control, she was still my sister. Family obligation ran deeper than personal grievances, or so I told myself, as I drove to her downtown penthouse with my toolkit of recovery software and data restoration programs. Pippa's place was immaculate as always, all white furniture and crystal surfaces that looked like they belonged in an interior design magazine. Fresh orchids and expensive vases, abstract art that probably cost more than my annual salary, not a single item out of place. She greeted me wearing designer yoga pants and a cashmere sweater that somehow managed to look effortlessly elegant despite being loungewear. "You're a lifesaver," she said, leading me to her home office. "The screen just went black during a system update. I'm terrified I've lost everything: client files, presentation materials, months of work." The laptop sat on her glass desk like a patient waiting for surgery. I plugged in my external drive and began running diagnostic software while Pippa hovered nearby, wringing her hands with convincing distress. "I'll make us some tea while you work your magic," she said, disappearing into her gourmet kitchen. The recovery process was routine. I'd done this countless times for colleagues and friends. As files began populating on the screen, I absently scanned the folder names, looking for anything labeled Meridian or Crisis Management Presentation. Instead, my eyes caught on something that made my blood freeze solid in my veins. A folder named Megan Project sat prominently in her documents directory, updated as recently as yesterday. My hands trembled as I clicked it open, and the contents made the room tilt around me like I was standing on the deck of a sinking ship. Inside were dozens of screenshots, images of my email inbox, my federal case files, my private correspondence with court officials. Each file was meticulously labeled with dates and case names. There were photos of documents from my desk, taken at angles that suggested they'd been captured quickly when I wasn't looking, during family visits when I'd trusted her enough to leave sensitive materials visible. The room seemed to spin as I scrolled deeper. Notes written in Pippa's neat handwriting accompanied many files. Witness cooperation breaking down, perfect timing to suggest Megan's losing control of case. Judge Morrison frustrated with prosecution delays. Use this. Blackstone reassignment successful. Megan's credibility compromised. My throat constricted as the implications crashed over me like a tsunami. Every mysterious technical failure, every missed deadline, every moment when I'd felt like I was losing my mind, It had all been orchestrated with the precision of a federal operation. But the worst discoveries were yet to come. A subfolder labeled Tanner Intel contains screenshots of his social media accounts, his business website, even copies of his company's client contracts. She'd researched him as thoroughly as any federal investigation, mapping his interests, his professional vulnerabilities, his personal history with an attention to detail that would have impressed Dad's most experienced agents. Another folder contained voice memos, apparently recorded after her conversations with him. I clicked on the most recent file with hands that felt disconnected from my body. "Marcus, you won't believe how perfectly this is working out." Pippa's voice bubbled through my headphones with undisguised delight. "Tanner is completely under my influence now. I mean, he was Megan's boyfriend, but that just made it more interesting, like winning the ultimate prize." Her friend's voice was harder to hear, but Pippa's responses painted a clear picture of their conversation. Of course I feel bad for her, but honestly, she's always been so pathetically desperate for male attention. It's almost sad how easy this was. Besides, Tanner deserves someone who actually challenges him intellectually. Megan's competent, I'll give her that, but she's so ordinary. The recording continued for 15 minutes. 15 minutes of my sister dissecting my relationship, my personality, my worth as a human being, with the clinical detachment of a scientist studying insects. The career sabotage is just bonus revenge for all those years of Dad treating her like the perfect daughter. She continued. "Do you know she actually thought she deserved that senior prosecutor position? Like being a workaholic robot somehow makes you executive material." I sat in her pristine office, tears streaming down my face as I listened to her catalog my failures and inadequacies with gleeful precision. This wasn't sibling rivalry or jealousy. This was something darker, more calculated. I heard her footsteps returning from the kitchen and quickly closed the folders, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. When Pippa appeared with 2 steaming mugs of herbal tea, I somehow managed to keep my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "Almost done. Just need to run one more recovery scan to make sure we got everything." "You're amazing," she said, settling into the chair beside me with that radiant smile that had charmed everyone for 26 years. "I don't know what I'd do without you. Family is everything, isn't it?" The casual way she said it, like she wasn't systematically destroying my life while I sat 3 feet away from the evidence, made bile rise in my throat. I finished the recovery process on autopilot, my mind reeling with the magnitude of her deception. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every interaction with Pippa replayed in my head, viewed now through this horrifying new lens. The way she'd insisted on helping me organize my home office last month, claiming she wanted to understand my work better. How she'd borrowed my laptop when hers was acting up during family dinner, spending 20 minutes alone with my federal case files. The innocent questions about my projects, my deadlines, my relationships with judges and colleagues. I needed more evidence. If Pippa was capable of this level of systematic manipulation, there had to be additional proof. Over the next week, I became a detective investigating my own sister, using every technique Dad had taught me about digital forensics and behavioral analysis. The fake email accounts were the first breakthrough. Using advanced search protocols I'd learned during cybercrime prosecutions, I traced several suspicious messages that had been sent to my supervisors over the past 6 months. jblackstonewitness@gmail.com had been sending complaints to Mr. Ames, claiming I'd been unprofessional during witness interviews and suggesting I might be experiencing personal stress that was affecting my judgment. The writing style was too polished, too perfectly crafted to damage my reputation without seeming overtly malicious. But the real smoking gun was hidden in her cloud storage, files she'd apparently forgotten to encrypt or delete. Email chains between Pippa and my colleagues revealed a web of manipulation that stretched back months, each message carefully designed to plant seeds of doubt about my competence and stability. I'm so worried about Megan, she'd written to Paul Lester 6 weeks before I lost the Blackstone case. She's been under tremendous pressure lately, and I think it's affecting her judgment. As her sister, I feel obligated to mention this. If you notice any signs that she's struggling professionally, please let me know. Family is all we have, right? Paul had responded with reassurance about keeping an eye on me, completely unaware that he was feeding information back to my saboteur. Similar messages had gone out to federal judges, court clerks, even support staff in my office. Pippa had positioned herself as the concerned sister managing a family crisis, gathering intelligence while appearing to offer help. But the most devastating discovery came buried in her draft messages, emails she'd composed but never sent, containing detailed strategies for undermining my relationships with clients and federal agencies. She'd mapped out my professional network like a military campaign, identifying weak points and planning her attacks with surgical precision. One draft made my hands shake as I read it. Phase 1. Establish credibility with Megan's federal contacts as concerned family member. Phase 2. Document her stress indicators and professional vulnerabilities. Phase 3. Strategic interference with key cases and deadlines. Phase 4. Romantic target acquisition and relationship termination. Tanner had been part of her plan from the very beginning. The engagement announcement came 2 weeks later, delivered with the theatrical flair Pippa had perfected since childhood. I thought I was attending a regular family dinner. Mom had mentioned wanting to discuss Christmas plans and Dad's upcoming retirement party. I arrived straight from court, exhausted from another day of putting out fires I hadn't started, wearing a wrinkled suit and yesterday's makeup. Pippa was radiant in a flowing cream dress that matched her engagement ring. Our grandmother's ring, the one I'd always been promised as the eldest granddaughter. Tanner sat beside her, looking happier than I'd ever seen him in all our months together. His arm draped possessively around her shoulders, and when he looked at her, his eyes held the same adoration that had once been reserved for me. "We have wonderful news," Mom announced, beaming with pride and dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Pippa and Tanner are engaged." The room erupted in congratulations and tears of joy. Dad shook Tanner's hand vigorously, while Aunt Carol hugged Pippa with genuine affection. Everyone was talking at once, sharing memories of their whirlwind romance and planning engagement parties and wedding dates. I sat frozen in my chair, watching the scene unfold like a nightmare in slow motion. This was my family celebrating my sister's engagement to my former boyfriend, wearing my grandmother's ring, planning their future together in the ruins of my systematically destroyed life. "Aren't you going to congratulate your sister?" Mom asked, her voice carrying a note of reproach that suggested my silence was being noticed by everyone. "Of course," I managed, standing on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. "Congratulations, Pippa. You got everything you wanted." She looked at me with those beautiful blue eyes that had charmed everyone for decades. And for just a moment, I saw something cold and calculating flash across her features. "Thank you, Megan. That means everything, coming from you." As the family continued their celebration around me, I realized that Pippa hadn't just stolen my boyfriend or sabotaged my career. She'd orchestrated the complete destruction of my life with the patience and precision of a master strategist. And she'd made it look like love. That night, I drove home in a daze. The weight of Pippa's engagement ring burned into my memory like a brand. But as I sat in my empty apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of my former existence, something fundamental shifted inside me. The grief and shock crystallized into something harder, sharper, a determination that surprised me with its intensity. I pulled out my laptop and created a new folder, Project Justice. What followed were the most productive weeks of my life, though not in any way my former self would have recognized. I became an investigator, a digital archaeologist excavating the systematic destruction of my existence. Every evening after work, I spread documents across my dining table like a detective in a crime thriller, creating timelines that mapped Pippa's interference against my professional failures. The pattern was breathtaking in its precision. Every major career setback coincided with a period of increased contact between Pippa and my federal colleagues. The Blackstone case reassignment happened 3 days after she'd had lunch with Paul Lester. My calendar glitches always occurred within hours of family gatherings, where my work laptop sat charging in Dad's kitchen, accessible to anyone who knew basic password protocols. I printed email timestamps, cross-referenced social media posts, and documented every instance where Pippa had positioned herself to gather intelligence about my cases. The evidence filled 6 federal case binders, each section marked with color-coded tabs that would have impressed my most meticulous supervising attorneys. But documentation alone wouldn't be enough. I needed leverage, and I needed it to be federal in scope. The breakthrough came when I started analyzing the metadata from her stolen files. As a federal prosecutor specializing in cybercrime, I had access to digital forensics tools that went far beyond standard data recovery. What I found was a pattern of unauthorized access to federal computer systems that constituted multiple felonies under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Pippa hadn't just been gathering information from conversations and visible documents. She'd been systematically hacking into federal databases, court filing systems, and encrypted communication networks. The digital breadcrumbs were all there, hidden in file creation dates and access logs that she'd assumed no one would ever examine. More damning still, her corporate consulting firm had been using this illegally obtained information to provide crisis management services to clients who were under federal investigation. She'd been selling advance warning about prosecution strategies, witness cooperation agreements, and grand jury proceedings to companies facing criminal charges. This wasn't just personal sabotage, it was federal corruption on a massive scale. I spent 3 weeks building an airtight case, using every skill Dad had taught me about evidence collection and every legal principle I'd learned in federal court. When I was finished, I had enough evidence to put Pippa away for 20 years under federal racketeering statutes. But I wanted more than just legal justice. I wanted the same kind of public humiliation she'd inflicted on me, the complete destruction of her carefully constructed image in front of everyone who mattered to her. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Saturday morning, I woke to my phone buzzing with a text from Pippa. "Emergency! Can't find my wedding cake design anywhere. Did I maybe leave the plans at your apartment when we were looking at inspiration photos? So panicked. The tasting is this afternoon." My blood turned to ice as I rushed to my bedroom. The shoebox where I'd kept all my wedding planning materials, photos, vendor contracts, cake design sketches, sat empty on my closet shelf. She hadn't just stolen ideas. She'd taken my actual wedding plans, down to the specific cake design I'd spent months perfecting with the pastry chef. But this time, I was ready for her. I called her back, injecting just the right amount of concern into my voice. "Oh my goodness, that's terrible. Let me check thoroughly. Maybe they got mixed in with my work files." "You're such a lifesaver. I'm meeting with the caterer at 2, and I had my heart set on that specific design. You know how important this engagement party is for Tanner's business contacts." The casual cruelty of it, discussing stealing my wedding plans for her engagement to my former boyfriend, required every ounce of self-control I possessed. But I'd learned patience from watching federal investigations unfold. Sometimes justice required perfect timing. "I'm so sorry, but I can't find them anywhere," I said after making appropriate searching sounds. "Have you checked with the original designer? Maybe they kept copies of the consultation materials." We spent 20 minutes on the phone, me offering suggestions while she performed increasing levels of distress. The entire conversation was a masterclass in manipulation. She knew I knew she'd taken them, and she wanted me to suffer in silence while pretending to help her. But this time, I was documenting everything. Every call was recorded, every text message was saved, every interaction was building towards the moment when federal justice would finally balance the scales. The engagement party was exactly the opportunity I'd been waiting for. My investigation expanded beyond digital evidence as I began reaching out to former colleagues, approaching conversations with the careful casualness that would have made any FBI agent proud. I was building a federal case, and that required witness testimony to corroborate the documentary proof. I was just thinking about you, I told Rebecca Martinez, a former colleague who transferred to the Boston U.S. Attorney's Office last year. How are you settling in up there? After appropriate catch-up pleasantries, I steered the conversation toward workplace dynamics and information sharing between offices. It's funny how different federal office cultures can be, Rebecca said. Like, people here are so direct compared to our old office. Remember how everyone was always walking on eggshells around certain situations? What do you mean?
Well, like when your sister reached out to warn people about your situation last year. Everyone was so careful about how to handle things, trying to be supportive without overstepping professional boundaries. My grip tightened on the phone. My sister warned people about me? She was just looking out for you, said you were going through a really tough time, dealing with some personal stress that might be affecting your work performance. She asked us to be patient with you and let her know if we noticed any concerning behavior that might indicate you needed professional help. The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, but I heard little beyond the confirmation that Pippa's campaign against me had extended across multiple federal offices. She'd been painting me as mentally unstable to colleagues in different states, creating a narrative of psychological breakdown that explained away my professional difficulties while positioning herself as the devoted sister managing a family crisis. 3 more similar conversations revealed the scope of her character assassination. Former teammates admitted they'd been briefed about my alleged struggles. Federal judges had received subtle warnings about my reliability, framed as family concern for someone experiencing a mental health crisis. Even court clerks had been approached with suggestions about how to support me through my difficult period. Each revelation added fuel to the fire burning in my chest. Pippa hadn't just sabotaged individual cases, she'd systematically poisoned my professional reputation across the entire federal justice system. The technical preparation phase began that Sunday. I spent the day learning advanced presentation software, practicing until I could seamlessly integrate audio files, video clips, and document displays that would function flawlessly under pressure. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was using the same technological skills that had made me valuable as a federal prosecutor to orchestrate my sister's downfall. Pippa's voice confession became the centerpiece of my presentation. I edited it for maximum impact, removing her friend's responses and combining her most damaging admissions into a 4-minute audio track that painted a devastating portrait of calculated malice. Her laugh, especially that cruel, delighted sound when she described stealing Tanner as the ultimate prize, would haunt anyone who heard it. But I had something even more powerful than personal recordings. Using my federal access to financial crime databases, I traced the money trail from her illegal information sales. Pippa's consulting firm had received over $3 million in payments from companies that were simultaneously under federal investigation. Payment schedules that corresponded exactly with major developments in their criminal cases. I created backup files, tested the audio quality on different speaker systems, and practiced the timing until I could execute the revelation with courtroom precision. The presentation included email screenshots, financial transaction records, digital forensics reports, and the voice recording, all organized to tell the story of federal corruption with the kind of evidentiary clarity that would satisfy any judge. More importantly, I'd already shared copies of everything with Dad through secure federal channels. FBI Director Paul Holden now had a complete case file documenting his daughter's systematic criminal enterprise. The formal investigation would begin the moment I activated the evidence at her engagement party. The days leading up to her engagement party passed in a strange bubble of calm. I'd expected to feel nervous or angry, but instead experienced an almost zen-like peace. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what was going to happen next. The uncertainty that had plagued me was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence that comes from holding absolute federal authority. I practiced expressions in my bathroom mirror, the surprised confusion when seeing my stolen cake design, the gracious congratulations I'd offer for her engagement, the innocent bewilderment when technical difficulties began affecting the evening's entertainment.
My reflection showed someone I barely recognized, composed, strategic, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with emotional outbursts or confrontational drama. The woman staring back at me had learned to play Pippa's game with federal resources, and I intended to win with the full weight of the United States justice system behind me. Friday evening, I laid out my outfit for the engagement party. A simple navy dress that wouldn't compete for attention, modest jewelry that suggested humility rather than celebration. I wanted to appear as the overlooked sister, grateful to be included in such a joyous occasion. In my purse, I placed the small device that would change everything, a federal evidence transmitter that would simultaneously record everything and stream it directly to Dad's FBI task force. The storm had been building for months, but tomorrow night, federal justice would finally break. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crystal-clear clarity that makes every detail sharp and unforgettable. I drove to the Riverside Country Club with my hands steady on the wheel, my heartbeat calm and measured. The venue Pippa had chosen was predictably elegant, soaring ceilings, cascading crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. She'd always had impeccable taste when spending other people's money, though tonight I knew exactly whose money had paid for this extravaganza. The valet took my keys with a polite smile, and I walked through the grand entrance carrying my small black purse and the weight of federal authority. The sound of laughter and clinking champagne glasses drifted from the main ballroom, punctuated by the gentle hum of a string quartet that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Then I saw it. My wedding cake, standing in all its four-tiered glory at the center of the dessert display. Every detail was exactly as I designed it during those careful consultations with the pastry chef. The alternating chocolate and vanilla layers, the hand-piped sugar flowers that matched my planned bouquet, even the delicate pearl trim that had taken weeks to perfect. It was my dream cake in every detail, standing as the centerpiece of Pippa's engagement celebration. The sight of it should have devastated me. Instead, I felt the cold satisfaction of a federal prosecutor who just found the final piece of evidence needed to secure a conviction. "Doesn't it look absolutely divine?" Aunt Carol gushed to Cousin Jennifer, their eyes bright with admiration. "Pippa has such exquisite taste. That design is so unique. I've never seen anything like it." "She's always been so creative," Mom agreed, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I don't know where she gets these ideas." The surreal quality of the moment threatened to overwhelm me. These people, my family, my blood, were celebrating the woman who had systematically dismantled my life using stolen federal information, and they were doing it with genuine love and happiness. But tonight, that would change forever. Pippa stood near the cake like a princess in a fairy tale, surrounded by a circle of admirers who hung on her every word. She wore a flowing silver dress that caught the light like liquid mercury, her engagement ring, my grandmother's ring, sparkling as she gestured animatedly. Tanner stood beside her, wearing a charcoal suit that brought out his eyes, playing the role of devoted fiancé with Academy Award-worthy conviction. "Megan!" Pippa's voice rang out like a bell as she spotted me across the room. "Come see the cake. Isn't it absolutely perfect? The designer really outdid herself with this creation." The twisted irony of that statement, making me complicit in admiring my own stolen work, nearly broke my composure. But I'd practiced for this moment. "It's absolutely stunning," I said, meaning every word in ways she couldn't imagine. "So unique and personal, it really captures your creative vision." "Thank you, sweetheart. I wanted something that would really represent us, something that came from the heart." Throughout the evening, I watched Pippa work the room with her usual mastery, accepting congratulations and sharing carefully edited stories about her romance with Tanner. She made sure to include me in several photos, her arm around my shoulders as she smiled for the camera, the picture of sisterly love and family unity. "We should do a special presentation," I suggested during a brief lull in the festivities. "I noticed you have that gorgeous projection system set up. It would be lovely to share some memories of your relationship journey, maybe some behind-the-scenes moments that show how you two really got together." Mom clapped her hands together. What a wonderful idea. Megan, you're so thoughtful. I'd be happy to set it up, I offered. I brought my laptop with some materials I thought you might enjoy. Professional documentation has its advantages. Pippa's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. That's sweet, but we didn't really plan for. Nonsense, Dad interrupted, appearing beside us with the quiet authority that came from decades of federal law enforcement. Megan's brilliant with technology. Let her work her magic. 20 minutes later, I had the projection system configured perfectly. The large screen descended from the ceiling like a theater curtain, commanding attention from every corner of the room. I tested the audio levels, adjusted the brightness, and loaded my files with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent months perfecting this moment. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced, my voice carrying clearly through the professional sound system. If I could have your attention for a special presentation celebrating Pippa and Tanner's journey together. The room quieted as guests turned toward the screen, champagne glasses paused halfway to lips, conversations trailing off into expectant silence. Pippa stood frozen near the front, her face a mask of polite anticipation that couldn't quite hide the growing alarm in her eyes. In my purse, the federal recording device was already transmitting everything directly to Dad's FBI task force. Across the room, I caught his eye and saw the slight nod that meant federal agents were in position. It was time for justice. The first slide appeared on the screen, an email chain between Pippa and my former supervisor dated 6 months ago. The subject line read, "Urgent, concerns about federal prosecutor Megan Holden's mental stability." The text was large enough for everyone to read, her words projected in crisp, undeniable clarity. "I'm deeply worried about my sister's recent behavior in federal court," the email read. "She's been making uncharacteristic errors, missing crucial deadlines, and showing signs of what might be a serious psychological breakdown. As her family, we feel obligated to alert relevant authorities before this impacts ongoing federal cases." Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. I watched faces transform from celebration to bewilderment as they processed what they were seeing. Aunt Carol squinted at the screen, her champagne glass frozen in midair. "What is this?" Uncle Jim asked, his voice cutting through the growing tension. The slides continued automatically, each one more damaging than the last. Screenshots of fake federal witness complaints Pippa had submitted to discredit my cases, evidence of her accessing classified federal databases through illegally obtained login credentials, documentation of her selling prosecution strategies to companies under federal investigation, complete with wire transfer records showing millions in payments. Pippa's face had drained of all color, the radiant joy replaced by stark horror as she realized what was happening. She lunged toward the projection controls, but Dad stepped forward, his FBI director's badge now visible on his jacket. "Pippa, I need you to step away from the evidence display," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of 30 years in federal law enforcement. "This is now an active federal investigation." "It's not what it looks like," she said, her voice rising with panic. "This is taken out of context. Megan's been struggling, and I was just trying to protect federal resources from—" Her words died as the audio began. The room filled with her own voice, crystal clear through the professional sound system. "Marcus, you won't believe how perfectly this is working out. I've got Tanner completely under control now. I mean, he was Megan's boyfriend, but that just made it more interesting. Like winning the ultimate prize while simultaneously destroying her credibility as a federal prosecutor." The collective gasp was audible. Mom's handkerchief fluttered to the floor as her hand flew to her mouth. Tanner's face went ashen, his eyes fixed on Pippa with growing horror. "Of course I feel bad for her," Pippa's recorded voice continued, that cruel laugh echoing through the stunned silence. "But honestly, she's always been so pathetically desperate for recognition. It's almost sad how easy it was to manipulate federal case information to make her look incompetent." "Turn it off," Pippa screamed, lunging for the controls again. "Turn it off right now." But Dad was already moving, producing federal arrest warrants from his jacket. Pippa Holden, you're under arrest for violations of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, federal corruption, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent." The recording played for another minute, long enough for everyone to hear her describe her systematic infiltration of federal computer systems, her sale of classified prosecution information, and her complete lack of remorse for compromising national security to destroy her own sister's career. When it finally ended, the silence was deafening. Tanner approached Pippa slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. Without a word, he reached for her left hand. The engagement ring, our grandmother's ring, slipped off her finger and into his palm with barely a whisper of sound. He looked at it for a long moment, then placed it gently on the nearest table. "Tanner, please," Pippa whispered, tears streaming down her face as federal agents moved into position around the room. "Let me explain. This isn't what you think. The federal charges are trumped up. Megan's jealous and she's manipulating evidence." He walked past her without a word, past the shocked family members, past the ruined cake and abandoned champagne, and out the door. The room erupted into chaos. Voices overlapped in confusion and accusation as family members demanded explanations, while Pippa sobbed, now in federal custody. But underneath their shock, I could see understanding dawning, recognition of the systematic deception that had been occurring under their noses for months. "The federal investigation has been ongoing for weeks," Dad announced to the room, his FBI director's authority commanding immediate attention. "What you've witnessed tonight is the conclusion of a complex cybercrime case involving illegal access to federal databases and the sale of classified prosecution information to criminal enterprises." I stood quietly by the projection controls, watching the scales of federal justice finally balance themselves. For the first time in months, I smiled with genuine happiness. The chaos reached a crescendo as Dad's task force formally processed the scene. Federal agents were photographing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and documenting everything that had transpired. Pippa was already being transported to federal holding, her carefully constructed life crumbling exactly as she had systematically dismantled mine. But this time, she'd committed federal crimes against the United States government. And FBI Director Paul Holden never lost a case. The chaos reached its peak as federal agents secured the scene, transforming Pippa's elegant engagement party into an active crime scene investigation. Dad's voice boomed over the confused chatter, his FBI director's authority cutting through the mayhem like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need everyone to remain calm and stay exactly where you are. This venue is now part of a federal investigation and we'll need to collect witness statements from everyone present." Pippa was already being escorted toward the exit by two federal agents, her silver dress trailing behind her like the remnants of a shattered dream. Her carefully applied makeup streaked down her cheeks in dark rivulets, transforming her from radiant bride-to-be into something tragic and desperate. "This is all fabricated evidence," she sobbed, gesturing wildly at the projection screen. "Megan's sick, she's jealous, and she's constructed this entire federal conspiracy because she can't stand that I'm successful. Can't you see what she's doing? She's manipulating you all." But her protests fell on deaf ears. The federal evidence was too comprehensive, too precisely documented to be dismissed as sibling rivalry or personal vendetta. Bank records showing millions in illegal payments, classified federal documents found in her personal files, recorded admissions of criminal intent, the case was airtight. Mom stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "The voice recording, Pippa, that was your voice. We all heard you accessing federal computer systems illegally." "It was edited, manipulated. Megan's always been good with technology. She could have created fake audio files, doctored the evidence. Federal prosecutors know how to fabricate cases."
"Enough." Dad's voice cut through her desperate explanations with the finality of a judge's gavel. "Federal audio analysis will confirm the authenticity of all recordings. Digital forensics doesn't lie, and neither do financial transaction records showing payments from companies under active federal investigation." Grandma Rose, despite her recent stroke, managed to speak with the authority of her 82 years. "I raised you better than this, Pippa. Federal crimes aren't family disagreements. Pippa's frantic gaze swept the room, searching for a single face that might show sympathy or belief. Instead, she found only disappointment, shock, and growing understanding of the magnitude of her criminal enterprise. Uncle Jim shook his head slowly. Cousin Jennifer covered her mouth in horror. Even the catering staff had stopped serving, transfixed by the federal drama unfolding before them. "You're all turning against me because of her lies," Pippa whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. The fight was draining out of her as surely as the color had drained from her face. I walked calmly to the projection controls and switched off the display. The sudden darkness seemed to break whatever spell had held the room frozen. "I think we've seen enough federal evidence for one evening," I said quietly. As federal agents completed their preliminary evidence collection, family members began approaching me with expressions ranging from shock to shame. The woman they'd celebrated for her charm and success had been revealed as a federal criminal who'd used illegal means to destroy her own sister's career. "Megan," Mom said, her voice heavy with something that might have been guilt, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. I don't know how I missed what was happening. I don't know how I failed you so completely." Dad approached with the measured step of someone who'd spent decades balancing federal authority with family relationships. "The investigation will continue," he said formally, "but I want you to know, as your father, not as FBI director, I'm proud of how you handled this. Building a federal case while maintaining your professional integrity, that takes real character." The family reckoning continued throughout the evening as federal agents finished their work. Aunt Carol admitted she'd always felt something was wrong about Pippa's meteoric rise in corporate consulting, but had dismissed her instincts when confronted with such apparent success. Uncle Jim confessed he'd seen Pippa badmouthing me at family gatherings, but had assumed it was typical sibling competition, not criminal conspiracy. One by one, they came forward with their own pieces of the puzzle, moments of uncomfortable clarity they'd chosen to ignore, instances where Pippa's explanations hadn't quite made sense, times when my distress had seemed disproportionate to the situation because they hadn't understood the systematic federal crimes being committed against me. The professional vindication began immediately. As news of the federal investigation spread through law enforcement channels, colleagues who distanced themselves started reaching out with apologies and explanations. The narrative of my mental instability crumbled under the weight of documented evidence showing deliberate criminal sabotage. "We should have questioned it," Paul Lester called to confess. "Your work was always exemplary. When someone's family reaches out with concerns about federal security issues, we took it seriously, but we should have verified independently." Within days, I had 3 job offers from different U.S. attorneys' offices, each one representing a significant promotion and salary increase. My reputation, far from being destroyed, was enhanced by the revelation that I'd maintained professional integrity while under systematic federal criminal attack. But the most profound changes were internal. I started therapy with Dr. Eleanor Rodriguez, a specialist in federal crime victims and psychological manipulation recovery. "You survived a systematic federal crime spree designed to destroy your professional credibility and personal relationships," Dr. Rodriguez explained during one of our sessions. "The fact that you were able to gather evidence and build a prosecutable case while under this kind of criminal attack shows remarkable resilience and legal acumen." Learning to trust my own perceptions again was perhaps the hardest part of recovery. Years of having my reality questioned by someone committing federal crimes against me had left me second-guessing every instinct, every emotion, every professional decision. Dr. Rodriguez helped me understand that my instincts had actually been accurate. I had sensed something was systematically wrong, even when I couldn't identify the criminal source. "Federal criminals are sophisticated in their manipulation techniques," she said. "Your sister used advanced psychological warfare combined with actual cybercrime. The fact that you recognized the pattern and documented it legally shows your training as a federal prosecutor served you well." The woman who emerged from this process bore little resemblance to the one who had tolerated federal crimes against her for so long. I learned to set boundaries, to demand respect, to recognize criminal manipulation tactics before they could take root. Most importantly, I learned that I deserved success and happiness based on my own merits, not as consolation prizes from people who felt sorry for victims of federal crimes. The federal trial was a media sensation. Pippa's case became a landmark prosecution for cybercrime and federal corruption, with legal scholars analyzing the intersection of family relationships and national security breaches. Her consulting firm was shut down by federal authorities, and several of her corporate clients faced their own federal investigations for knowingly purchasing illegally obtained prosecution information.
During her sentencing hearing, Pippa made one final attempt at manipulation, claiming that family loyalty had motivated her actions and that she'd only been trying to protect federal resources from an unstable prosecutor. The federal judge was unimpressed. "Miss Holden," Judge Patricia Colby said from the bench, "you systematically infiltrated United States government computer systems, sold classified federal prosecution strategies to criminal enterprises, and compromised ongoing national security investigations. These actions constitute some of the most serious federal crimes this court has seen. The fact that your victim was your sister makes your crimes more heinous, not less." Pippa received 15 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. Her federal conviction record ensured she would never again be able to work in consulting, crisis management, or any profession requiring security clearance. But justice, I discovered, was more than punishment. It was restoration. 18 months later, I met Thomas at a federal cybersecurity conference in Washington. He was presenting on financial crimes investigation techniques, and his methodical approach to digital evidence analysis reminded me of my own work building federal cases. Our first conversation lasted until the hotel bar closed, covering everything from constitutional law to favorite books to childhood dreams shaped by growing up in federal law enforcement families. "You have this amazing strength," he told me during our third date. "Not the kind that comes from never being hurt, but the kind that comes from surviving federal crimes and choosing to keep building a career in justice." Our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect for each other's work in federal law enforcement and genuine affection that had nothing to do with competition or criminal manipulation. Thomas celebrated my courtroom victories without feeling diminished by them, supported my career ambitions without trying to redirect them toward his own benefit. Most importantly, he saw me clearly, not as a victim of federal crimes or a reflection of his own worth, but as a complete person who happened to be an excellent federal prosecutor deserving of love and professional recognition. When I bought my new wedding dress, I chose it for myself alone. Ivory silk with subtle pearl details, elegant without being ostentatious, beautiful without being desperate for attention. It represented the woman I'd become rather than the woman I'd hoped someone else might love despite being the victim of federal crimes. The wedding was intimate, filled with people who knew my story and celebrated my strength. Federal colleagues, law enforcement friends, family members who had learned to recognize and reject criminal manipulation, all gathered to witness something built on honesty and mutual respect rather than stolen federal information. As I walked down the aisle, I caught sight of someone unexpected in the back row. Pippa sat quietly, wearing her federal prison uniform instead of designer clothes. She'd requested permission to attend through the federal correctional system, and I'd granted it. She looked older, diminished, in ways that had nothing to do with the institutional clothing. She was no longer the golden girl commanding every room's attention. She was simply another federal inmate serving time for crimes against the United States government. For the first time in our lives, that felt exactly right. The truth had set us both free, though in very different ways. As Thomas and I exchanged vows, I felt the weight of federal justice finally balanced in my favor. 3 years after the federal conviction, I received an unexpected letter delivered through the Federal Bureau of Prisons correspondence system. The return address showed Pippa's federal inmate number and the FCI Danbury facility where she was serving her sentence. Inside was a single sheet of regulation prison stationery covered in her still elegant handwriting. "Megan," it began, "I know you have no reason to read this, and even less reason to believe anything I write. Federal prison gives you a lot of time to think about the choices that brought you here, and I've spent every day of the last 3 years trying to understand how I became someone capable of committing federal crimes against my own sister. The federal counselors here call it narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features. The clinical terms don't make what I did any less criminal or harmful, but they help me understand that my need to win at any cost wasn't normal sibling rivalry, it was a pathological pattern that escalated into federal crimes. I won't insult you by asking for forgiveness. Federal judges don't forgive cybercrime and corruption, and neither should families. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what I took from you wasn't just a career or a relationship. It was your sense of reality, your ability to trust your own perceptions. That's a special kind of federal crime, attacking someone's sanity while making them question their own competence. I've read about your new position as senior federal prosecutor for cybercrime. The articles say you're revolutionizing how federal courts handle technology-based evidence. I'm proud of you, even though I know I forfeited the right to feel pride about your accomplishments when I committed federal crimes against you. You were always the stronger one, Megan. I just couldn't stand that everyone might eventually notice. I hope your marriage brings you the happiness I tried to steal. Federal prison teaches you that some damage can't be undone, but new foundations can be built on honest ground. Your sister, by blood, if no longer by right, Pippa, federal inmate number 47829-084.
I read the letter 3 times, sitting in my new corner office at the Department of Justice. Outside my windows, the Washington Monument stood against a clear blue sky, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I felt something approaching peace. Thomas found me there an hour later, still holding the prison correspondence. "Federal mail?" he asked, recognizing the official markings. "Pippa," I said simply. She wrote from prison. He settled into the chair across from my desk, his expression carefully neutral. Thomas had learned not to rush to judgment about anything involving federal criminals, even reformed ones. "How do you feel about it?" I considered the question seriously. "Sad," I said finally. "Not for her. She's exactly where federal justice says she belongs. But sad for what our family could have been if she'd been capable of celebrating other people's success instead of committing crimes to destroy it." "Do you think the rehabilitation program is working?" "Maybe. The language sounds like someone who's actually engaged with federal counseling rather than just serving time. But understanding why you committed federal crimes doesn't erase the fact that you chose to commit them." That evening, I sat down at my home computer and wrote a response, not to Pippa, but to myself, a letter I would never send but needed to write. "Pippa," I typed, "I received your federal correspondence. You're right that I can't forgive federal crimes, and I won't pretend that understanding your psychological diagnosis changes what you chose to do. Federal courts don't operate on the basis of personality disorders, they operate on evidence and criminal intent. But I want you to know that the federal investigation you triggered ultimately made me stronger. Building that case taught me to trust my instincts, to document everything, to never doubt my own competence when faced with systematic criminal behavior. Those skills have made me better at my job, prosecuting other federal criminals. You asked me once why I thought I deserved recognition for my work. The answer is simple. Because federal law enforcement requires people who won't compromise their integrity, even when criminals in their own family try to destroy them. I hope federal prison teaches you to find worth in something other than other people's failure. I hope you learn to build instead of destroy. I hope you discover that success earned honestly feels better than victories stolen through federal crimes. I won't be writing back to your federal facility because that chapter of my life is closed. But I'll remember the sister you could have been before you chose to become a federal criminal instead. I'm building something new now, something honest and strong and completely mine, something that can't be stolen or sabotaged or destroyed by anyone else's criminal behavior. That's what federal justice looks like, not revenge, but the restoration of truth and the ability to build a life on honest ground. Megan Holden, Senior Federal Prosecutor, Cybercrime Division, United States Department of Justice. I saved the letter in a file labeled Closure and never looked at it again. Some stories end with forgiveness, others end with justice. In federal court, justice is enough. 5 years later, I stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, receiving the Attorney General's Award for Excellence in Federal Prosecution. The citation read, "For innovative approaches to cybercrime prosecution and exceptional dedication to justice in the face of personal adversity." President Harris shook my hand as cameras flashed, but my eyes found the faces that mattered most in the small audience. Thomas beamed with pride, holding our 18-month-old daughter Sarah, who was more interested in the Secret Service agents than the ceremony. Dad stood in his dress FBI uniform, tears in his eyes, as he watched his daughter receive the highest honor the Department of Justice could bestow. Mom dabbed at her eyes with the same lace handkerchief she'd used at Pippa's engagement party, but these were tears of joy rather than confusion. Grandma Rose, now 87 and using a walker, had insisted on attending despite the travel difficulties. She wore the engagement ring, my grandmother's ring, on a chain around her neck, having decided it would come to me when Sarah was old enough to understand its complicated history. The Attorney General said in her remarks, "This award recognizes not just professional excellence, but the courage to pursue justice even when the crimes hit closest to home. Prosecutor Holden's work has revolutionized how federal courts handle cases involving family members who commit cybercrime, establishing legal precedents that protect other victims of systematic criminal manipulation." After the ceremony, reporters gathered for questions about the landmark legislation I'd helped draft, the Family Cybercrime Protection Act, which created specific federal protections for victims of criminal sabotage by relatives. Pippa's case had exposed a gap in federal law that allowed family members to escape serious consequences for systematic criminal behavior because it was dismissed as personal drama rather than federal crime. The federal criminal justice system now recognizes that family relationships don't excuse cybercrime, federal corruption, or systematic sabotage. Criminal behavior is criminal behavior regardless of DNA. That evening, we celebrated at Thomas's favorite restaurant, a quiet place where the servers knew us and the atmosphere encouraged conversation rather than performance. Sarah babbled happily in her high chair while Thomas and I shared stories about our respective workdays. "How does it feel?" he asked, being officially recognized as one of the country's top federal prosecutors. I considered the question seriously. "Earned," I said finally. "For the first time in my life, success feels completely earned through honest work and documented competence." Any regrets about how we got here? About Pippa's federal crimes? No. About the years I spent doubting myself when I was actually the victim of systematic criminal behavior? Sometimes. But those experiences taught me to recognize criminal manipulation patterns that I now use to help other federal crime victims. As we drove home through the Washington evening, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. A federal cybercrime investigation that began with a sabotaged wedding cake had evolved into a career dedicated to prosecuting criminals who use technology to destroy other people's lives. Our house, the one Thomas and I had bought together, with money earned through legitimate federal employment, sat on a quiet street lined with cherry trees. Sarah fell asleep in the car, and Thomas carried her inside while I stood for a moment in our driveway, looking up at the stars. Somewhere in federal prison, Pippa was probably lying in her narrow bunk, counting down the remaining years of her sentence. I didn't think about her often anymore, but tonight I hoped she was learning to find peace in honest reflection rather than criminal schemes. The federal justice system had worked exactly as designed. Crimes were prosecuted, victims were vindicated, and truth ultimately prevailed. In my purse, my phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from colleagues around the country. Federal prosecutors, FBI agents, judges, and law enforcement professionals who understood that justice requires people willing to build cases even when the criminals are family members. I smiled, turned off the phone, and went inside to my honest life. Some stories end with revenge, others end with restoration. The best ones end with justice, earned through federal law and sustained by truth.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.